Welcome to the next installment of the NPC 2021 podcast. My name is Jason Hugheskirk, and I am here to introduce to you today's podcast. The podcast will feature John Wynia in a conversation with Doug Sikkema as they talk about the role of classical education and how that style of education fits into doing reformed education on purpose. We hope you enjoy, and we'll see you in September.
Welcome to the NPC 2021 podcast. It's May 17, 2021. I am John Wynia. I'm part of the NPC 2021 convening committee. And at NPC 2021, we want to look at what it means to do reformed education on purpose. Today, I am joined by Doug Sikkema, who is here to talk to us about classical Christian education and what that looks like at Oak Hill Academy in Ancaster, Ontario. Thanks for being with us today, Doug. First of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, John, for having me, and to all the conference attendees. This is an exciting conference, I think. I like that idea. I love the title of it, Reformed Education on Purpose. And just your little intro, it made me and our principal at our school, Jesse Newton, want to sort of be involved and think about ways that we can be sort of nourished by this. So I am currently an assistant professor at Redeemer University. My appointment is in English and the core humanities, more the core program. That's kind of the area. So I'll be starting this year as a tenure track professor. Before this, I was in sort of sessional capacities.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. I have a dissertation in American literature at the University of Waterloo. So that's my kind of research area. And I like to call it like the accidental classical teacher and sort of founding member of our little school, Oak Hill Academy, out in Hamilton. We're in Ancaster right now and sort of serving the greater Hamilton area. So my wife, Vanessa, and our 4 kids, we live out in Binbrook, and we were part of the startup Oak Hill Academy in 2017 when that began with a group of parents. We started that school in 2017, and that's a longer story that we can talk about.
Sure.
But I've been board chair since the first year, so I'm currently the chair of that board. And I come from like my own background, like sort of what got me into this world of academia and starting up a school is I was a teacher myself. So I was a Redeemer undergrad studying philosophy and English. And then I taught in the secondary level at a Christian school for about 4 years before I jumped into my doctoral studies. So I have experience like in the classroom as a teacher teaching English and history. And this was a Christian private school that was ministry inspected, so followed OSSD curriculum and that kind of stuff. During my dissertation, I was also sort of brought into the world of Christian research through Cardis, which is a think tank, for those of you who might not be familiar, based in Hamilton as well, that does sort of public policy research out of a distinctly reformed Christian perspective. So while I was at Cardis, I had a number of different hats that I wore there. So one was senior researcher, and the research I did, some of you might have come across it or read it, is in the education file. So we did a lot of research on graduate outcomes of different sectors in Canadian and in US education. So we looked at private schools, Catholic schools, independent schools, homeschool, and of course the public sector. The public sector was always kind of the baseline against which we sort of measured ourselves. I won't get into all of that, but I have that was like a real sidetrack. That was like jumping into data analysis and statistics. So I really got familiarized with the world of education policy and education research. So that was kind of the hat I wore for about 5 years while I was doing my dissertation. So after that, sort of fast forward, now I'm at Redeemer and working with Oak Hill.
Okay, cool. One thing I know that you didn't mention, and maybe that's just because you wanted to keep it a secret, Doug is my cousin. Oh. We were classmates at Redeemer. But maybe it's better if we just don't go into those times. Let's get back on topic. Let's talk about classical Christian education. Give us the elevator pitch. What is classical Christian education? What's it all about?
Yeah, so this is like the $1 million question. And I always feel like when someone says, give me the elevator pitch, I'm like, no, here's like the David Hicks Bible called Norms and Nobility, which is like 200 pages to get. So first of all, I think I'll just start with this. Is like, I think when a lot of people hear classical, a lot of kind of connotations come up in their mind. Some of them are accurate, some of them aren't. I do think we use the term classical in this kind of movement that's now taking place in Canada, but has been in the US arguably since the late 80s, when the kind of Christian classical movement with Doug Wilson schools, etc., started growing. So through the 80s and 90s. And we kind of use the word classical, but traditionally what's meant by a classical education is that you're going back to the classical world, the world of antiquity. You're teaching students Latin and Greek primarily. And then really the end game of that education is to get them to read primary sources like Plato's Republic, or the dialogues of Plato, or the tragedies of Sophocles, or something like that in the original languages. Okay, so we don't really have that classical bent to us. Now that's usually what's meant by classical. So I think maybe a more accurate term, even though we are Christian classical schools, is that we're liberal arts schools with a focus on great texts.
So students at Oak Hill are not studying Latin.
No, so we are studying Latin. We do study Latin. Latin is important, and we do see Latin as a foundation to language studies. But the end game of our graduates is like we don't sort of see them as like getting to grade 12 and being able to sort of parse through close readings of the Aeneid, right? That's not really the end game of it. So I think that's when the Renaissance humanist kind of world recovered classical. A lot of it was around that. So we're not necessarily doing that. So what are we doing in a classical school? I think my pitch kind of has three main parts to it. The one thing we do, and this is sort of putting the accent on the Christian side of it, classical Christian, is that we want to tune the heart. We want to tune the heart of a child to sort of resonate with the truth of the gospel. So we want to cultivate in them what Augustine called the order of loves, and that they would learn to love God above all, love their neighbor as themselves, right? It's really that basic, but we want the school, everything about our curriculum, about our habit training, about our formation, to be this cultivation of love. So we have kids immersed in scripture. We have a liturgical rhythm to the day. We have opening meeting where we're teaching them catechism. But we want the school to really be about the formation of love. And if we can't be about that, and not just any kind of love, but a love that sort of submits to the authority of God's word and what God reveals to us as the things that we should love and care about. Again, if we can't do that, then the other stuff doesn't matter. Okay, so it's Christian probably first. Classical, though, the two other elements of the sort of elevator pitch I get, and this is presumably a very long elevator ride.
We're going
this is like Empire State Building elevator pitch.
Yes.
So we want to furnish the imagination, and this has to do with content. So we want to make sure that students are immersed in some of the best things that have ever been read, thought, written, created. And this, to me, is one of the problems we address, because I do think a lot of modern education, Christian and otherwise, has sort of given up on this inheritance. So we want to immerse students in the inheritance, the heritage of the Western cultural tradition primarily, because that's the world in which we exist. And that's such a rich tradition that I think a lot of students today don't know anything about. So we want to furnish that imagination. And then finally, we want to train the mind. So it's not just about the what that's in your head. It's not just about the great stories and the great art and the math and the science that you kind of fill the mind with, but then it's how do you actually train the skills of mastery, of memorization, of appreciation for students. So this is a famous essay in the classical movement, The Lost Tools of Learning, you may have heard of, by Dorothy Sayers. But that's it, is to give students these tools, because really, we know at the end of even a grade 12 education, they're just scratching the surface of what they can possibly still learn. So to create lifelong learners is to give them these tools that they can now go out and master other disciplines and use those skills for whatever vocation they find themselves in.
Okay, yeah. So if I summarize that for our viewers, is it fair to say that classical Christian education is really about Christian academic excellence? Like, is that kind of a fair 3-word summary or not?
That's a fair summary. I think we are allergic to the word excellence. It can kind of sound elitist. And I know even in the Greek world, that word arete, which gets translated later on as virtue, which is, again, this idea of excellence, we can be kind of allergic to it because it smacks of an unhealthy humanism, or right. But yeah, I would say it's Christian and academic excellence. I think it's a really good way of framing it, because the academic excellence is we do want our students to strive after a mastery of all the best things that are out there, to know them, to be able to think through them, to be able to speak eloquently about them. Yeah. But it's also Christian excellence in the fact of it's in service to God, it's humble, and it's not seeking selfish gain, but it's using these tools in service to God and his kingdom. Yeah,
so I guess what I was thinking of is kind of that idea of this content that you want to really expose them to the best content, right? Like that it's this excellent stuff that you're presenting to your students.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about how you came to classical Christian education, and you've already talked a little bit about Oak Hill Academy, but if you can kind of fill in some of the details of how you went about establishing the school.
Yeah, that's a good question. So my story is a kind of long and winding one. I'm actually, not only am I John Wynia's cousin, and yes, we did sort of live together for a little while we were at Redeemer. My identical twin brother, he actually lives in Texas, and he was part of a classical school there. So that's sort of the first time I ever really heard about the movement. I didn't really know. So he was pursuing an education in history at a graduate level, and he got a job at a school called Live Oak Academy out in Waco, Texas. And it was on one of my visits there that he was kind of showing me around the school. And I said, well, what is like a classical Christian school? What does this look like? And he was teaching grade 4 at the time, and his students were reading bits of the Odyssey by Homer. They were studying Latin. They were thinking at a very high level and being introduced to things that I had personally not been introduced to in undergrad, in graduate school, even at a doctoral level. Like most of these sort of highlights of the Western tradition were never required reading. So when I saw his school, I was like, oh, that's an interesting model, right? That you're introducing kids at this very young age to this kind of education. So I came back to Hamilton, and this was just beginning the PhD, and we met with a friend of ours who's also interested in classical, because his kids had been at a classical school in Ottawa, and we kind of talked and said, hey, would you ever want to start a classical school? And we both said yes, and then we had no time, no commitment to actually follow through on it. A few years later, an ad came out on Facebook by Jesse Newton, and it was saying, if there's any interested families who want to think about another way of schooling, come for this meeting. We're going to talk about classical Christian education. So that's in 2017.
So he just put it like in the Hamilton Spectator, there was an ad, or
it was on, I think it was on social media somewhere. Like it was actually forwarded to me by a friend because it's part of a church bulletin thing. I think they threw it on Facebook.
Yeah.
And then a friend of mine said, hey, Doug, you've always been talking about classical. Like your brother does this.
Yeah.
You should check this out. So Vanessa and I, we went on a Saturday morning, and there was like 20, 30 people. And there was the principal of the Toronto School, Westminster. At the time, his name was Dennis Doty. So at the time, his name is still Dennis Doty.
Yes.
But at the time, he was the principal at Westminster. And he kind of walked through the vision of their school. And Vanessa and I were like, how do we sign up? So from that meeting, Jesse, who's now our principal, he called sort of monthly meetings where we just met together to do readings on what classical Christian was, and then to do sort of very practical, strategic meetings as to what do we need to get incorporated, who do we need to hire, where do we need to rent a building from, et cetera. Like, how do you actually start up a school? Because most of us had no idea. So that kind of ushered me into the world of classical.
So can you tell us a little bit, like you mentioned that Jesse had organized readings. Can you talk a little bit about who you're reading, who we should be reading if we want to know more about classical Christian education?
Yeah, sure. So one of the classic essays is Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning. And Dorothy Sayers, if you don't know, she was sort of like an honorary Inkling, kind of rubbed shoulders with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and those folk in the sort of early to mid 20th century. So Dorothy Sayers' essay was really influential, oddly enough, in America, not in England. And it sort of kickstarted some of the classical Christian schools that emerged in that movement. And the argument that Dorothy Sayers makes in that essay, just to kind of reduce it to like the Coles Notes version, is that students move through sort of roughly 3 phases. She called it a grammar phase, a logic phase, and a rhetoric phase. And she's using the language of the liberal arts tradition, which is the trivium. So those 3 are the language arts. There's also the quadrivium, which become the more mathematical arts. And the 4 and 3 together make 7, the 7 liberal arts.
Yeah.
Regardless, so Dorothy Sayers kind of repurposes that language, and she says in the grammar phase, which is roughly when a child's in grade 1 to about grade 5 or 6, they are sponges. And I think any of you who have kids, you know this. Your kid can absorb insane amounts of information, right? I think a PhD in archaeology knows just a little bit less than a 5-year-old about dinosaurs, right? Because they know everything, right? Yeah. So she says that in that phase, that's really when you furnish the imagination. So don't fill it with drivel. This is the chance to introduce them to Homer, to introduce them to the Aeneid, to introduce them to great art and great stories. So that's the grammar phase. And then in logic, now they're like a sponge that has absorbed all kinds of water. When you squeeze it, something comes out. And when we kind of want something in grades 7, 8, and 9 in terms of what they can think about, what they can write about, often we get frustrated as teachers. And I know I get frustrated even with university students, and I'm like, I want you to do this. But when you squeeze, it's dry. There's nothing there. The mind hasn't been furnished. So in the logic phase, you think about how these things are connected. What are the relationships between the things that I know? And then the rhetoric phase is now, how do I use what I know and how it's connected to eloquently write about it, speak about it, and be sort of persuasive and charitable about it. So that's Dorothy Sayers' essay. For anybody who wants kind of like an intro to, I'd recommend that essay. In a similar vein, C.S. Lewis and his Abolition of Man. It's just a series of essays that's also really significant for, again, what Lewis was seeing with the rise of kind of progressive utilitarian education and arguing for really a recovery of a kind of classical humanist education. So C.S. Lewis makes the argument as well. A really important book is David Hicks's Norms and Nobility. It's a little bit more academic, but that's one that's sort of like a Bible, if you will. It's one of the texts that really kind of define the classical Christian movement. So I'd really recommend that as well. And Douglas Wilson, he kind of did a revamp of the Dorothy Sayers, just called The Lost Tools. So that's another one that's helpful to read about. Susan Weisbauer, she wrote that History of the World curriculum that a lot of the classical movement and even homeschool movements are using, which is that idea of history as the spine. So her History of the World helps students at a young age just get that kind of temporal bandwidth or that historical consciousness from a very early age. So Susan Weisbauer is really helpful. And she's also written a book called The Well-Trained Mind, which is more towards like homeschool families, but it's been really significant in the classical movement because it's about basically knowing the kind of books you need to read, the kind of rigorous curriculum you need to what she calls to create this well-trained mind, which is part of the vision of a classical education. So those are a few of the books. A few others that I just sort of throw out there as titles to go Google and get onto Amazon and order. Eric
Somebody's got a book budget.
Exactly. Eric Adler, just a recent one that came out, is called Battle of the Classics. That's more of a historical look at what do we mean by classical, what do we mean by humanist. Chad Wellman and Paul Ryder, they're both out of University of Virginia. They're doing a lot with like higher education and what do we mean by the great books and classical education. So I'd recommend their stuff as well. And then good old Canadian Northrop Frye. He's got a little book called The Educated Imagination, which is just a delightful little romp. And I'd recommend it too.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. We have a good sense of kind of the background of Oak Hill. Talk to us a little bit about the mission and vision then of Oak Hill Academy. Like, so you have painted a good broad brushstrokes picture of what classical ed is. Now, what does that look like in practical reality at Oak Hill?
Yeah, so our mission statement is nurturing wonder, wisdom, and virtue in Christ through a banquet of truth, goodness, and beauty. So we kind of developed that idea in our first year. And you could see there again, it's distinctly Christian, right? Like, where do wonder, wisdom, and virtue come from? Well, they're rooted in Christ. And we want to give students this idea of a feast of all that's true, good, and beautiful in the tradition so that they can sort of inherit it, they can receive it as gift. I think one of the things we're also kind of trying to address through that mission statement is a lot of our education has kind of looked away from this tradition out of like, I don't want to say just ignorance, but also like the spirit of suspicion, right? John, you and I kind of both studied English, so you know that kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, right? That idea.
Critical theory,
that kind of like, but yeah, to just say, well, it's too white, it's too Western, it's too patriarchal, and we've sort of veered away from it. And I think actually today, kids are not even suspicious of it because they've never been introduced to it, so they don't even know what it is. So one of the things we want to do is recover that idea of a feast and a gift that you have to receive. And it's not to say you can't be critical of it, but what does that mean to be aware of it, to be immersed in it, to know it, and to learn how to like charitably read it, right? And be part of it. So our vision statement, sort of along these lines, if that's our mission, is we do believe education is the extension of the home. It's not the extension of the state. It's not the extension even of the church. We work in concert with the church. We are a school for Christians. But our vision is that we do come alongside parents, and that our teachers are sort of in loco parentis. They're an extension of the home, and that we will provide a distinctly classical and distinctly Christian education. So a few of the like guiding core values, if you will, to kind of practically bring this home that we want to create at Oak Hill is this idea of mastery. That students don't just get sort of moved along the system because they're aging, right? Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, you've now moved on from grade 1, you go to grade 2, and we really try to focus on a mastery of the concept. So you have to prove or show that you grasp this lesson in Singapore math before moving on. You've memorized this poem. You're reading at this level before there's just a necessary kind of push through the system. So mastery is a big part of our kind of classical value. History being the spine is probably another very distinctive feature of classical, where this is an idea from Susan Weisbauer, but it's the idea that history should form the spine of knowledge. And we try to immerse students not just in the great tradition or the great texts or great books or what have you, but how does that actually connect to a historical timeline of which you're part? So knowing not only when the Reformation or what happened in the Reformation, but when it was, and what's its relationship to the Renaissance?
So like ideas have a history kind of a thing, right?
Exactly. Because I don't know about you, and I know, John, you're more like historically minded. I was more in the sort of English field. But one of the things that always shocked me about a lot of undergraduates, it still does, even when I see them coming in, is how unmoored they are in time. They don't know when a lot of things happened. And I think it's such a product of our sort of Ontario curriculum, where there's kind of a focus on post-war 20th century history, and then not a real sort of continuity, at least in the high school experience, of the greater story from, like, let's say, the Greeks to the postmodern age, right? That a lot of students don't really grasp that. So in the classical world, students already in grade 1 are going to be on this rotating cycle of history, going from the ancient world to the medieval world to the early modern to the modern world. And they'll go through that cycle 3 times by the time they graduate. And then we try to connect in their art, their literature, and other aspects of education to sort of plug into that spine so that history is not something they're just steeped in. So our vision of a graduate is someone who's very aware of when they are in time and when things have happened.
So I think personally, this is one of the things that I find the most appealing about classical education is that connection to history, because I share with you those concerns about students that are really unmoored. And, I think you talked about this whole idea of the Western tradition. And people are looking at it with suspicion now, but it comes from somewhere, right? Like these ideas come from somewhere, and they make sense in history. And some of the things that people are saying, well, why don't we do this? Or how come we're so white? Or how come we're so whatever? These questions have come up before, maybe not in the same way, but they've been dealt with. And so connecting people to the past is a huge part of shaping them for the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's to me one of the highlights of the course I'm teaching right now is like the core program, but we really kind of immerse first year students into the story. And for them to realize that, like, oh, the Trudeau prime minister, like his decisions as prime minister, or the Trump presidency, these are not just things that happen in a vacuum, but there's much longer stories behind them. And I kind of jokingly say to my students too, it's like, you can't understand the modern world if you don't understand the fall of Rome, right? And it's true though. It's like so much of the modern world is made up by the breakup of the Roman Empire and what happened in the sort of intervening centuries since. Things even like World War I, which leads to World War II, which leads to the world that you and I know, are so connected to all of these pieces. So yeah, I think it's one of my favorite things as well with classicals is that immersion in history.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into some practicalities. So we've talked, I mean, you've touched on it again with things like mastery and this historical spine that Oak Hill is trying to connect with all of its educational, all the aspects of education. Talk a little bit about what every day looks like practically at Oak Hill. Like, how would a visitor to your school see that this is a classical school when they come in the doors?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've been thinking through, because in many ways it's not so like disruptive and revolutionary, and it's just like quietly beautiful, I think, and it's deceptively simple. So when you walk into our school, I think one of the things that strikes first-time parents, and I'll say this because we've been now immersed in it for about 4 or 5 years, so it's starting to become less strange to me. But for new families who come into the school, they often really love how low tech it is. So one of the things we really try to curate in our school is the atmosphere or the culture. This is an idea that comes from Charlotte Mason, is that school is an atmosphere. It's not just what you learn and your curriculum. It's everything. It's everything from the art on your walls to the routines of your day, all of that stuff. So we try to curate that atmosphere to again, put before them beautiful art. So there's often beautiful art hanging on the walls from one of the maybe master painters that they're learning about in their picture study. And I'm surprised when my 7 and 8 year olds come home and they're like, do you know about Pablo Picasso? Let me tell you a little bit about him and his art. Do you know William Kirilak and MC Escher? And so and it's not pretentious. I think that's one of the things that, like, well, what's the difference? It can sound very pretentious, but it's actually just beautiful because it's like, this is what we're kind of filling the mind with or furnishing the imagination with. You'll notice a routine of liturgical rhythms in the school. So we start every day with what we call morning meeting. And these are still a work in progress as we grow and try to scale it. But it's to begin the day with the Word of God, to begin the day in fellowship and in community. So there's a singing of the anthem. There's a singing of some hymns. There's a memorization of part of the New City Catechism, which we're doing together. And it has changed its rhythms a little bit. So, and especially with COVID, some of that stuff has shifted. But there's a focus on, there should be a liturgical rhythm to the day. One of the other things that families note as different is that when you kind of walk through the hallways as well, part of the atmosphere we try to create is one of respect and hospitality to visitors. So anybody who kind of walks into a classroom, students will kind of stand up beside their chair. They'll say welcome to the guest. And we want to try to cultivate that spirit of being open and being welcome to the stranger in our midst, and curating a whole culture of chivalry and respect and decorum that, again, is not just rules, right and wrong behavior, but it's a whole spirit of virtue. And at the end of the year, we sort of assess character much more than almost anything else. If you look at our report cards, a lot of it is about their sort of academic and their sort of personal character and virtue. So how disciplined are they? How persevering are they? Do they make friends, and do they seek out the kid who's not accepted? Or right, so that's really what we're kind of looking for, and our teachers assess that almost as much, if not more, than assessment for sort of mastery in the subjects.
Yeah, so in Ontario we have these like learning skills and work habits on the report cards, and I'm guessing you're familiar with them. but that's things like initiative and organization and collaboration, those kinds of, I think they touch on character assessments. Can you get into a little bit how this is different from that, or is it different from that?
It's probably not like vastly different from that kind of language, let's say, but it's first and foremost, I would say, in the sort of assessments that we have for students. I wish I'd brought with me a report card. We could have kind of pulled it and walked through it.
Yeah.
But that we don't spend a lot of time on like sort of formalized quantitative assessment. At least that we're only right now a JK to grade 6 offering. I know when we get to high school, some of that stuff will change. But we like the idea in the classical world of assessment being really just to draw near to somebody, and that the teacher is in relation with the student. They know where they're at. They know if they're mastering the concept on sort of one-to-one feedback, but they also know their character by being around them in the class, out of the class, on the schoolyard. And a large part of their report card at the sort of trimester marks will be about those character traits.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you just touched on mastery, because I was kind of hoping to circle back to it. Mm. But let's say, so if I have a daughter in grade 2, if I send her to Oak Hill, how does she progress through grade 3? Or whatever. You said it doesn't really work that way, but talk about that a little bit.
How does she progress through grade?
Yeah, like how does she advance the next level of her education?
Yeah, so that's, again, there's probably a lot of different things involved in that in terms of like the reading competency and like ability to write, etc. So it depends on the subject, but there will be, again, criteria set out by the teacher and the curriculum team in terms of what skills and knowledge are required for this grade, and that they can reach that. So that's one of the things that I don't say it's like a turn off from our school, but we do an initial assessment, and a lot of students who will sort of initially come in will actually start earlier than their like year, what they sort of presume is their year because of when they were born. But really, no, based on their knowledge of this and their skills in this, they actually could be 2 or 3 years younger. Now, we will do our best with the teachers at our team to make sure by the end of that year they're back with their age group and their cohort. But they have to sort of show signs of mastery before they can just sort of move on in that. So really, it's a hard question to answer because it depends on where that student is at precisely.
Okay.
But for my children, let's say with penmanship, there's a certain quality in the 100 words that they have to know, that they have to reach before they can move on to the next word. Okay. So they have to show that they've mastered the shape of that word, and they won't just chew a few times, oh, it's not great, but you'll get better, keep on moving. It's like, no, indicate mastery. And once you can slowly do it and show it, then you get to go to the next phase. Yeah. And it's challenging because I think some teachers will have a few keener students, like we know as teachers, that can show mastery really quickly, and others that will require a lot more work and need more attention to get them there.
Yeah. So what is like special education support? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's one of the things that is being sort of felt out by us as a school because we're so new. So we, depending on the situation, so far students that have had special needs have been able to succeed based on help from teachers primarily, working very closely with the parents. One of the things that is key in the classical model is that we are an extension of the home, not a replacement of the home. And often when a student is struggling, that means more work from mom and dad to help. Okay. So, and then if it's a really special scenario, an EA might need to be brought in for that student. Okay. And we've had that in one scenario. But there's a book called Simply Classical, which is all about this, because I think one of the myths about classical as well is it's really academically elitist and it's not for struggling students. Okay. And it doesn't have to be. It's a challenge because it's academically rigorous, but mastery is possible for all kinds of students.
Let's get into, so the conference, we want to talk about 4 kind of specific questions that we're going to be looking at all different education models through the lens of these 4 questions. So who is the learner? Who is the teacher? What's the purpose of education? What's the character of education? Let's dive into that a little bit. What does that look like at at Oak Hill with classical Christian education in terms of understanding who is the learner?
Yeah, so who is the learner, which is basically the child? This is really significant for the classical movement. And I would also say that we're a classical school, but we're also like inflected by or influenced by Charlotte Mason. And Charlotte Mason did a lot of work in the homeschool movement as a 19th century writer, sort of writing against the sort of techno-industrialist move that was happening in education. So she also informed some of our thought. And one of the things that she says that's really helpful for us as we think about who is the learner, it's the learner is the child. The child is the imago Dei. The child bears the image of God with or without our education. And I love that because I think sometimes we can almost have this default assumption for children is that we're going to help you become human. And that's actually a dangerous part of the humanist tradition that the classical model can be built on. And education is not a way for you to become human at all.
Yeah.
God has made us human. Our children are human. They have value before we teach them the alphabet, right? So I think that's important for us to remember. And Charlotte Mason also has this delightful phrase where she says, whenever you make an education decision, a hire, a policy, imagine the child kind of sitting on your knee and you're doing this for them, for him or for her. So that's what we try to take seriously in our school, is that children have a value that we do not give them. And that value comes from God. Now, we have a responsibility to them that God also gives us as parents to raise them up in the fear of his name, to raise them up in the way that they should go. So that child is already human, is already fully valued, but God wants us as parents, as the generation kind of further up the road, to teach our kids, right? Teach them who God is, to teach them where they are, when they are, and to usher them into a relationship with God. Now, we're humbled because we know that that's also out of our control, right? So we don't presume that in a Christian school we can sort of enact a child having a living relationship and response to the Creator who wants to love and know them. So again, Mason, she talks a lot about the role of the Holy Spirit in education. And she says this should humble you as educators, as executives, as admins, as boards, that you have to allow room for the Holy Spirit to be at work. You have to pray for it. But the Holy Spirit is what's going to make that connection with the child in terms of the relationship with Christ and the relationship with knowledge. It's the Spirit's activity that we can't believe we can control.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So would you say then that classical Christian education is is it child-centered education? That's kind of a big educational jargon kind of thing. Is it child-centered education, or is it different than that?
Yeah, it's in terms of, I think, what can be meant by child-centered education, it is child-centered in the sense that it is for the child. Like when we set up these schools and we're doing it, it's for the sake of the child. It's another one of the books that's kind of come out of the Mason movement, right? For the children's sake. So we do it for them, but it's not child-centered in the sense that they have any kind of authority to them, that we're going to sort of just be guided by their curiosity. It is the best metaphor, I think, is that you're sort of leading them, and that the parents and the teachers, they're in a position of authority, not to sort of crush a child's dreams and wishes, but to sort of lead them along a path that they don't know the way of, right? We're further down the path, and we're walking with our children, sort of on this pilgrimage together to an encounter with God, an encounter to new knowledge. But we do not sort of take that idea of just follow a child's curiosity wherever it will go, and that's a good model. No, we believe that there has to be a healthy level of teacher expertise and guidance that's going to sort of form a child, set the parameters for the child, and even like the process of curating what a child looks at and how they look at it is set up by us. So we don't abscond from our responsibility to do that and to do that well.
Yeah, so I think you're kind of leading us right into the next question, which is who is the teacher? And you've kind of already sort of laid the groundwork that teachers are there to lead children along. You want to talk a little bit further about that and maybe get into some practical kind of things about teacher-student relationships at Oak Hill?
Yeah. Yeah, so we sort of take I would say like a rabbinic model, which is that the teacher is someone that our children have to sit at their feet all day. And when we hire, so I'm thinking about this not so much as a principal, but as a board chair and someone who's making hires. The question that we often ask is, would I want my son or my daughter to sit at this person's feet for 6 or 7 hours a day? So the teacher has to, first and foremost, love Christ, be immersed in the Word, be a person of virtue and character. Our principal right now is working on a document called the Vision of a Graduate. So it's when an Oak Hill student gets all the way to grade 12, what do they look like? And that vision of a graduate is actually our template for a teacher. So a teacher should be the embodiment of our ideal graduate, because you cannot form a child, right, if you don't have those characteristics yourself. So that's one of the things that we think about a lot with our school and our hires. The teacher has to be, the language used in our kind of playbook or our strat plan is humble, hungry, smart. We want them to be people who are not proud, not arrogant, not self-seeking, but they are able to sort of condescend in the best sense of that word to where a child's at, and then sort of guide them along, lead them up, right? Take them with them. They're hungry in that they're lifelong learners. So they're always curious. They're always learning about all kinds of new things. And you probably know this, John, as a teacher. I find most of the real teaching happens outside of the classroom, or a lot of the real teaching, not most, but a lot.
Yeah.
So we talk about that. Who is this kind of teacher between the cracks? So between classes, at recess, after school, before school, what's the kind of atmosphere they create? Who are these people? Because if my son or daughter is just talking to them casually outside of a controlled classroom setting, I also want that to be life-giving and nurturing. So we seriously want our school to be filled with these kind of men and women that our students can model, that they can imitate.
So are you having trouble finding people like that, or is it not a difficult task?
The difficulty is not in finding like strong men and women of integrity and Christian character and virtue. That's we've been blessed by having amazing teachers like that, and there are a lot of people like that. The biggest challenge is having people who are also immersed in the content of classical education, because we're trying to build a thing that most of us never had ourselves. Right? That I don't know Latin. I didn't learn Latin, but I understand its importance and I want to learn it. So we're building a Latin program. We're going to hire someone who teaches Latin, but that's the harder part, right? Is finding people who can teach in a classical environment, who have an awareness of the great tradition, because most of us are reacting against an education that has gaps, and we're a product of those gaps, right? So that's probably the bigger challenge.
What's the impact like on the community? So we've talked now about who you want, and there's a really strong focus on atmosphere. What's been the impact on the broader community? And I think it does connect with talking about teachers and students.
One of the things that we've noticed, and this is true for all the classical schools that have started up in the sort of Ontario area in the last 10 years, is that classical seems to be kind of scratching an itch that people either knew they had or didn't even know they had.
Yeah.
So, and we went from our startup year in 2017 was just under 20 students with a handful of families. So my job was probably annoying my friends and people that I knew were kind of on the fence and like, okay, what's this kind of curious little school doing, to just trying to get them to see what was different. Like, come to the school, visit it, look at our curriculum, look at the stuff that we're actually reading. And by God's grace, I mean, we grew from 20 to 40 to 60, and now we're on pace to 80 or 90 for next year. And what a lot of those families will say, like the impact on the community, is this was the kind of education our children needed all along. They're not, and I'm not going to disparage other school models and other school systems, but with the limited time that our children have, we have to focus their attention. And I think so many times education can be about, okay, we have to deal with relevant cultural issues. We have to get children to problem solve for the problems of today. We have to get them immersed in this kind of technological training and give them an iPad so they can know how to navigate that. And those things are not bad, but with a limited 6-hour day, right, is that the best way you can be using their attention and cultivating it? So the impact on the community is they're amazed at what their students are capable of doing. I'm like, I didn't actually think my son or daughter could memorize 50 lines of poetry, and that's now part of them. I didn't know that they could do these like really difficult Singapore math problems, but they can. I didn't know that they could actually get away from all screens in the classroom and create this really restful learning environment, which is really rigorous. But when you go there, they never seem like overworked or strained or stressed out about it, because they've kind of rethought assessment and they're not working towards an A or a, right? But they're just trying to master the concept, and it's about the learning itself. Where teachers are not incentivizing students with free time but they're incentivizing them with the learning, right? Is that there's actually a joy to mastering a concept that doesn't need to have some kind of benefit added to it, right? So all the little subtle differences, our community has largely really, really enjoyed.
I think we've already touched on this, but let's circle back a little bit to what is the purpose of Christian education according to classical Christian education?
Yeah, the purpose of classical or liberal arts education, the best definition of this comes from that book I mentioned earlier, the liberal arts tradition. And I would say the best for me at least. And it's very simple. It's that education is the transmission of culture. Education is the passing on of a way of life from one generation to the next. And it's very broad, it's very ambiguous, but I think what that does is it ushers you into the language of the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that education is something that is very close to God's heart of what he wants from his people. Right? So when God asks the Israelites to make sure that they pass on the stories to their children and their children's children, and they ensure that their children walk in the way of the Lord and that they know the stories of the Lord, that they remember it, they're aware of the past, because who they are right now is part of God's ongoing story and how he's related to them in the past. So God does not ask the state to educate our kids. It doesn't ask anybody else, but it says, fathers and mothers, this is your job. So we're passing on a way of life. So for classical Christian education, we're just an institution that does that by the grace of God, with the sort of as an extension of the home with our children. So it's formative for them, and we're working together with homes and school to pass on this way of life. The classical distinctive, and we've talked about this already a little bit, but I don't want to say it's not enough. It's fundamentally, it has to be Christian, but it also has to be being aware of the sort of voices of the past, or the people who have gone before us. So what G.K. Chesterton would say is like the democracy of the dead, or in Alan Jacobs' book, we sort of break bread with the dead, is that there's this amazing inheritance of Dante and Boethius and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and the list goes on and on and on. And I, for the life of me, do not know why there is not more of an outcry as to why we're withholding some of this stuff from our children. Why can they go through most of modern life and adult life not even being familiar with them, let alone capable of reading them, let alone, and this is my dream, capable of writing and responding to them and becoming part of this great conversation. So to me, the purpose of Christian education has to be transmitting a way of life in the fullest sense of what that way of life is. Now, we're not just fully absorbing it and saying you don't have to be critical. We want also to give our students and our children a sense of what this heritage is, a way of reading it. So there's a hermeneutical lens that we're kind of teaching them how to look at it, how to perceive it by the light of God's authoritative word, right? So you read sort of along the path that God's word illuminates for us, and then a way to sort of make it their own. And in imitation, learn how to write, learn how to speak, learn how to behave in sort of eloquent and charitable ways as citizens in whatever vocation that they have. But for us, education is not about giving them job training. It's not about where they're going to sort of serve in the economy. It's giving them tools that will help them in those things. But those are sort of the happy accidents of becoming fully Christian, fully human, responsible. I don't want to just say citizens, but image bearers of God.
Yeah, so I think you're, again, leading us right into our next topic, which is the character of education. And I'm going to pick up two words that I think kind of, to me, highlight what you're telling us about the character of classical Christian education, or what classical Christian education says the character of education is. You used the one just toward the end of what you said there, talking about imitation. And the idea of inheritance. So can you kind of delve into that a little bit more? Like, if you had to answer the question, what is the character of education? What would your answer be? And what does that look like at Oak Hill?
At Oak Hill, yeah. Those are two important words, right? So imitation is one of the canons of rhetoric from the classical world. It's one of the ways of, if you're thinking about making a speech or any kind of oratory, imitation is sort of one of the ways you begin that process of thinking. And it's really interesting because I do think in our world of sort of technological innovation and revolution and creative disruption, we like to talk a lot about making something new, right? Saying something that hasn't been said before. We kind of, again, have this default tacit, almost like romanticism, that we're going to say something that's never been said before. We're going to do something that's never been done before. And I think the classical model helpfully pushes back in a way that's, I think, almost even reformational, which is we don't just need to say something new as if it's never been said before, but we need to, first of all, understand what has come before us. And then before we can even add our voice, we need to understand what those voices before us sounded like, what they said. So we imitate them. Any great artist, right? They start by imitating the masters. Great writers, they imitate the people who have come before them. And when they sort of tweak it, they play a variation on it, they kind of give a little jazz riff on it, then all of a sudden imitation moves into conversation. It moves into saying something sort of new about it. So I like that idea of when we're training up our children, it's not child-led pedagogy, it's not child-centered pedagogy, in the sense that they are the sort of creative source of all things that we need to appreciate and value, but they need to kind of work within the boundaries and forms of thought that has come before them. And when they can imitate and model it, that's giving them the tools and the muscles and the ability to now say something on their own. So that's the imitation side. The inheritance side is, we talked about this a little bit, but you are being gifted something from the generation that has come before us. And I think today we live in such a presentist world, right, where it's like everything just seems so important right now. And I have to react to whatever kind of polarizing topic about wearing a mask or getting a vaccine or any kind of movement, right? And it's so immediate. And when we think about the long story of our inheritance, as we were talking about earlier, you kind of give kids a historical consciousness that actually can calm their souls. It can, Alan Jacobs calls this a tranquil mind. But you become tranquil when you realize, okay, let's put this in the longer historical arc of where it comes from. Now, it still might be reason to panic or react or respond, but you're not doing it as sort of a knee-jerk gut reaction. So you have to give kids this inheritance. The other idea is that an inheritance is something of value that's been gifted to us. And not to sort of rehash what we've talked about, but don't keep kids from it because we're suspicious of it. Don't even give them this posture that anything that's come before us or that's ancient and old is boring, is probably outmoded intellectually, it's probably sexist, it's probably racist, it's probably misogynist. It's right. We can kind of move towards this where we're making these sort of gut reactions against the tradition, against those who have come before us, which is so bizarre. Because I think when you immerse yourself, like C.S. Lewis says, in old books, you realize how like alive and prescient and just full of humanity those older thinkers were. And not to say they don't have things that would startle us, and probably should, right? But there's also like immense gifts that they can give us. Just for one practical example, like you think about the debates between science and religion that are going on right now, and it seems like, oh, we're just in this like really vitriolic kind of debate about the importance of religion versus science, and you have this kind of rise of a new atheism. You read like the Summa, or like Thomas Aquinas, and it's like almost every answer you need to give to that debate is found there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is like, it's just ancient. Like this is not a new discussion by any stretch,
yeah.
Right? How does our reason relate to the revelation that God gives us?
Yeah.
How do those things interact? Faith and knowledge,
yeah.
Right? John Calvin is wrestling with this in his institutes, and it's an old conversation. So I think helping kids have the tools of the past and understand there's an inheritance that can be theirs, right? And once they know them, they can now use them. For some reason, we just keep this wealth away from them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's a really great answer. I guess we won't expect to see any Oak Hill students at protests where we're tearing down statues or iconoclasts.
Well, they very well could be. If it's the right, if there might be a logical reason for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the end of our agenda in terms of what we're going to talk about today. So, Doug, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate having you on today and hearing about Oak Hill. And I wish you and your school the best.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And it's been fun to talk about. And I hope it's a blessing for your conference and to hear more in this discussion in the coming days. So thank you.
Yeah, we're really looking forward, and kind of circling back to where we started with that reformed teaching on purpose. We're excited to continue the conversation together in late September.
Thank you once again for listening to this NPC 2021 podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and you were informed by the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you all in September of 2021, Lord willing.